Shalom. I am Dov Avraham Ben-Shorr. This is the second in the series of NoaH, of the covenant of NoaH. The first series was on the general concept of the covenant, the Brit, as was pointed out to me by someone that really the translation is a poor translation, but it's the best we got. So unfortunately, with the limitations of translating things and talking to an English-speaking audience, I will use the term covenant, the covenant of Bnei Noach. Today we will talk about the prohibition of murder. More to the point, we will talk about the idea, the concept of the sanctity of life and its importance. Which, to the point, another person sent me an email asking, where does it say that Cain was commanded against murder? Well, there he was. He was told specifically that he's not allowed to murder before he killed his brother Hevel, Cain being Cain, Hevel being, I think, Abel in English. In any event, Cain was commanded. He was commanded through his father, Adam, the first man, Adam Rishon, and we have the source for that. Our sages have a Masoret, a tradition that this is so. They bring the source in Masechet Tractate Sanhedrin, page 56b. Also, there's another little piece of it that's on 38a. We learn that from the day that Adam was created, the day that the first man was created, he was commanded with the 6 mitzvot of mankind, of humankind. Okay, the 7th one was added later with Noach. This is derived from the verse, chapter 2, verse 16 in Bereshit, Genesis, which states, "V'yetzav Adonai Elokim al Adam lemor mekol etz agan achol tochelu." In rough translation, that means, and God, Hashem God, Hashem is his name, right? Hashem God commanded upon Adam, saying, the rest of the verse talks about from all of the trees he can eat, he's permitted to eat, and then later the next verse talks about the exception to that rule. However, the sages say that the first part of the verse relates to all of the mitzvot that he was commanded, including the mitzvah, the prohibition of murder, of homicide. Now, again, to restate, it would be an extremely cruel, if not more, God that would hold us accountable for things that we weren't informed about ahead of time. And therefore, he, of course, gave us law, if not written, then through a commandment to in a prophetic sense, to the first man, Adam, and told him these mitzvot, which Adam then was obligated to tell to all of his descendants, which he did. And then later, this is repeated. Why is it repeated? Because after the flood, after God destroyed the world and brought Noah through the ark, he felt it was important to renew the covenant, because there was a renewal of the world. And therefore, to make sure there was no chance of doubt, he renewed what the commandments were and added a 7th commandment, which we talked about last week and we'll talk about again, against all these various things and for these various things, so that humans knew, man and women knew what was expected of them, so that they would be accountable. Otherwise, if you don't know what the rules are, it's hard to play the game. It's hard enough when you do know the rules, let alone if you don't know the rules. So God being good, in fact, he is the definition of good, he provided us with enough information to know how to behave, how to act, and how to fulfill the goal. The goal, of course, is perfecting the world, bringing perfection to ourselves and to others, and achieving the goal of drawing towards Hashem and perfecting the world and bringing heaven to earth, or earth to heaven, or reaching that goal of of completeness. So, as I said, the prohibition for murder was repeated to Noah. This is in verse 5 and 6 of chapter 9 of Bereshit, of Genesis. Now, unlike any of the other mitzvot, any other commandments, this is the Torah dedicates a tremendous amount of ink to this mitzvah, which reveals its importance, and its importance over and above the actual prohibition. Don't murder. But above that, it teaches us about the sanctity of life. This prohibition includes 2 verses that total 30 words. The next closest mitzvah in that is the new one about eating a limb from a living animal, about the sanctity of animal life, about the sanctity of nature, and not eating blood, etc. And that is only 6 words in 1 verse. So, just to give you a relative idea of the importance of it, sometimes we can tell the importance of an idea simply by the amount of ink given to it in the Torah. So, the reason for this, as explained by Ramban Nachmanides, right, is that more than simply a prohibition, it's an affirmation of the transcendental quality of the human species. We are more than simply an animal. Unfortunately, or fortunately, or that is what it is, we have a very animalistic side. Sometimes that's all that's revealed amongst certain people. But we are more than simply animals. We have also the potential of angels, of heavenly holiness, and to be able to transcend our physical nature. Okay, and so therefore the human life is holy. It has a sanctity to it. Okay, the Rambam writes, in fact, and we learned something special about this. I'll let the Rambam say it, actually, because he says things really nicely. Okay, the Rambam teaches that this is on the same verse. It's his commentary on the Torah on the same verse. He says, "From the hand of every beast will I avenge it." Wait a second. Animals are held accountable to the Rambam teaches again that how can an animal be held accountable for the murder of a human being? That seems almost absurd. Animals are acting according to their instincts, according to their nature. There should be no reason that they should be held accountable. But that's what the verse says. And so he says, I wonder if this vengeance from a beast can be taken literally in view of an animal not having any moral sense that justifies punishment or reward. Perhaps, however, because the loss of human life is involved here, as if by the king's edict that any animal that kills a man shall be killed, which explains the rationale for the Torah law that when an ox gores a man, the Beit Din, the court, has an obligation to kill that ox. Now, as the Rambam says, the murder of an ox should be stoned, and its meat should not be eaten. Surely this is not in the way of a fine for the owner, for even a wild ox must be executed. And this rule applies for the Noahites as well as for the Israelites. In other words, there is a principle of the sanctity of life that is over and above the simple idea that it's forbidden for me to murder my fellow. There is an idea that within each human being there is a spark of holiness, that the taking of that life is a desecration of basically Hashem's name. Especially since we are created in the image of God. And therefore, by taking the life, we are, in a certain sense, desecrating Hashem. We're desecrating. You kill the Son, it's like you're desecrating the Father. All right? You're offending the Father. Now, there are exceptions, of course, to the prohibition of murder. Obviously, a person who is defending his own life, self-defense, is permitted to defend his own life even at the risk of executing of killing the person that he that is threatening him. This falls in a principle. There are basically three mitzvot here, sub mitzvot, right, subcategories, which involve the rodef, the pursuer, someone that is threatening someone else's life. We have another commandment in the Torah that says that a man is not allowed to stand idly by the blood of his neighbor. If someone is threatening a third party, he's a rodef for someone else. I, as a Torah observant Jew, even if it's a non-Torah observant, I still have the obligation, as a Bnei Yisrael, I have an obligation to stop that person from killing, murdering, chasing this third person. Right? The rodef can be in actually a pursuer can be actually in several categories, including someone that is going after someone for illicit sexual relations by force. That also is another aspect of it. There are a few others, but we're not going to get into the concept of the rodefa at this point of the pursuer. But the basic idea is that self-defense exempts someone from punishment for taking another life. Is really the way it should be stated, because you have an exception. You're not liable. Okay, one shouldn't obviously intend to kill the person if there's another way to stop that person. Between this, there is a slight difference between Bnei NoaH and Bnei Yisrael, and I'll get to that in a moment. The Rambam tells us, and several others, that Chazal actually in Masechet Sanhedrin, page 57, that 57a, that Noahides are not obligated to stop another person from killing another person from the pursuer. They're not obligated to stop the pursuer, but they are permitted to stop the pursuer, which is different from Bnei Yisrael. The laws for Bnei Yisrael oftentimes are more exacting, more demanding, and therefore, as a Bnei Yisrael, one has an obligation to stop the pursuer, whereas a Noahide is permitted. The obvious implications of this is if that would endanger the Bnei Noach has a choice. If he feels that he doesn't want to because of his own danger to himself or whatever, he can obviously opt out. Of course, with the Bnei Yisrael, if there would be an implicit or intrinsic danger to the person in doing that, he also would not be obligated to stop the pursuer. But it's a little bit he's a little bit more under the gun, so to speak. However, this has the resulting thing that at least the Rambam holds that therefore, if one could stop the pursuer with means other than lethal means, in other words, not by killing him, but by stopping him, by maiming him, or stopping him in some other way, and one is unable to do, and one went over the top and killed him, Bnei Yisrael is exempted from punishment for that because of his obligation. He has more of a free pass on this because he had to act, and therefore we don't hold his measures. Whereas the Bnei Noach is not so. According to the Rambam, that if a Bnei Noach could have stopped the pursuer, but he used excessive force in doing so and caused his death, he would be liable for murder in that case, for homicide of some sort. Not necessarily first-degree murder, but some type of manslaughter or something along those lines. Now, the Ravad disagrees, by the way. The Ravad says, as long as there was no intent to kill, as long as he intended to stop the pursuer, whatever happened, and he is exempt as well. So there is obviously room for debate with some of these things, depending on who's involved and the various judges. It depends on, obviously, anything that occurred should be held before a court of law, and the judge, the sage, would make a determination as to what would happen and what were the circumstances of the situation. Just as it is today in modern courts, where if someone uses a self-defense defense, that is put under the light of a court, and they determine if that really was the case, or if and if he was looking for trouble, as they suggested that the gentleman several years ago, about 20 years ago, I guess, in New York subway was doing, then maybe he might be held accountable because he was actually looking for something along those lines. But of course, that all holds up to the laws of the court and the various rules of that. We're not going to get into the details of them because there are many, many, many details, and this is an overview. It is, okay. So, on the flip side, the idea of homicide is one of the 3 prohibitions that one cannot violate, even under threat to his own life, for Bnei Yisrael. For Bnei Yisrael, there are 3 mitzvot that 3 prohibitions that only 3, that if he violates them, he's not allowed to violate them even to save his own life. There are other mitzvot, prohibitions for Shabbat or for anything, or theft or what have you, that as long as it's not intended to be an uprooting of the Torah, in other words, if a king or a government says you're not allowed to do this because we don't want Jews to do this, then a Jew has to martyr himself in order to actually fulfill the rules of the king. However, if someone makes a rule not based on the person's Jewishness, but he holds a gun to your head and he says, I need you to steal the bank, rob the bank, or I'll kill you, a person is allowed to violate the mitzvah, the prohibition of theft, in that case, in order to save his own life. What he should do, we're not going to get into the details, but there are 3 things that he's not allowed to do to save his own life. One of them is murder. One is not allowed to murder a third party in order to save his own life. In other words, someone holds a gun to your head and says, kill so-and-so, or I'm going to kill you. One is supposed to say, my life is no more important than the other person, and therefore I am forbidden from killing him, and go ahead and kill me. What happens after the fact, if he's considered if he's held accountable, it's another story entirely. That again, leave it for the courts, leave that to the side. However, initially he's supposed to refuse. Right? There are 2 others, including illicit relations. In other words, someone says, sleep with that married woman or kill me. One's supposed to refuse. And the third is serving false gods. Those do not, a Noahide is not necessarily under that obligation. Again, that's a very detailed thing that requires tremendous amount of study, and we're going to move that to the side because there's a lot of varying opinions on that, so I'm not going to get into the details of that. But just so you understand the importance of the sanctity of life within the context of this mitzvah. On the other side of that, or on the positive side of that, the idea of preserving life is also, we are prohibited from speeding up the death of a person. We're prohibited from hastening the death of a person. Even someone, if they're suffering or what have you, we're not allowed to speed up their death because the body is only a vessel on loan. It's not our body. It's Hashem's. It's God's. He's given us on loan. We're allowed to use it. It's a deposit for our soul, which we use at His discretion, and therefore we're not allowed to hasten the death of a person. Which the flip side of that, of course, there's a lot of flips here. The flip side of that, it's forbidden to abort a fetus unless that fetus is threatening the life of the mother, and then falls under the category of a pursuer, a rodef, in which case, for sure, Bnei Yisrael would be able to abort the fetus. There's a debate as to whether that's the same case with Bnei Noach, but it means that one's not allowed to assist with that as well either. And we have an obligation to preserve life. Preserve life. In other words, we're also not allowed to commit suicide. That falls under the same rubric. It's not our body. It's not just I'm allowed not to murder someone else. I'm not allowed to murder myself either. Right? And falling under a subcategory of that means I'm also obligated to take care of the life that was given to me, that was gifted to me, that was given. So I should live healthy. I should try and eat properly, not abuse the body, not put the body in danger. It would prohibit on a large scale things like smoking or other dangerous substances, at least in excess, drinking and things like that in excess. things that seriously endanger the body, and any other dangerous activity. All of these fall into the rubric of the sanctity of life. We are holy vessels, and we should respect. And when we meet people, we shouldn't be worried about the physical goof, the body. We should be worried about the holy spark that's within, and that's who we should be meeting. Which means we should transcend ourselves. We should work at transcending the physical to get to the source of their life, which is the soul of the person, and really sanctify them and cherish them, because that source, that soul, is really a spark of the divine, a spark of holiness, and we should relate to people along those lines. And with that, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and you should have many blessings for this Shabbat, blessings of sanctity, and we all should learn to relate to each other this Shabbat and in the future, as we are all vessels, simply vessels of holiness. God bless.